Esteemed friends and guests and all in the conversation that we have on Wednesdays, where we ask the question, what is the common good, and what does that mean for us as faith leaders? So joined by four people that think about this a lot in our professional lives and in our personal lives. And today we're going to be talking about what is love. It's kind of this ancient question, actually, and this ever-present question that just keeps showing up is, how do human beings live like this? So you're in for a treat. We're in for a treat, actually, with each other, because we're kind of curious about how each of us think about all of this. So as I mentioned, I'm Doug Padgett in Minneapolis, and super glad to be with you all today. If you've been following the podcast regularly, you know we do this every day. But the last week or so, we've had a little time off, and I know people have been saying, hey, where are all of you? Just a lot of things going on in August. So glad to be back in the regular flow here with everyone. And as we often do on these Wednesdays, we're joined by Stephanie Rose Spalding. Good morning, Stephanie.
Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to be back with you for another Faith Wednesday. I am Reverend Dr. Stephanie Rose Spalding, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church of Colorado Springs. And again, it is such a joy to be able to engage in these conversations with these brilliant minds and workers, service of love and ministry. So again, just happy to be here. And I'm going to pass it to Laura.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everybody. Laura Truax. I am the pastor at LaSalle Street Church in Chicago, Illinois. And we do think about love all the time, all the time. What does it look like? What does it look like with skin on it? What are the words love uses? What are the characteristics of it? So this is going to be a fun morning to reflect on. Very hot in Chicago. We hit 98 yesterday. It's sweltering. And with that, I'm going to pass it to the brother in Atlanta. Go ahead, Dominique.
Good morning, everybody. Dominique Gilliard, serve as the Director of Racial Righteousness and Reconciliation for the Evangelical Covenant Church. And this conversation about love is a critically important one, particularly as we think about the church's mission, which is to make God's name known and love shown throughout the world. And so for me, when I think about this conversation of love, Dr. King's fingerprints are all over how I've come to understand love. So this will be a great conversation this morning.
All right. So we're representing Colorado Springs, Chicago, Atlanta, Minneapolis, and we'd love to know where you're listening in from. So put that note in the chat. And if you're just somebody who listens to the audio, send us a little note over at podcast@votecommon.good.com. We'd love to know where it is that you listen from. All right, so fellow pastor panelists, I've been pushing for a couple of weeks now to talk about this love thing because I actually do believe it can be the organizing principle for us in justice and in ministry and in life. I think it roots in sort of just the sheer understanding of what does it mean to be a human being. I mean, I think that's what that's what the call of love is about, is can we be more human and can we be in a way that's more loving. But the question of what is love is really quite significant, and I don't mean this in a philosophical way. I mean it in a real life way, because for so many of us, when we think about love, it's the emotional side of it, right? It's that you have a deep affection for someone. That maybe you feel passion for someone. Maybe you feel a bondedness to care for someone because you have a love obligation for them. But when you extend that then to a teaching like that Jesus has, to love your neighbor as you love yourself and to love your enemy as you love yourself, well, it feels to me like it's calling for something larger. And there have been a lot of times where I've been with other pastors especially, and you try to raise the idea that love is the primary driver. And even in works of justice, to say we have to make sure we stay on the love path. There's people who just become really disconnected to that, right? They're like, I don't even know that love is an organizing principle. Like, it's a bit Tina Turner, what's love got to do with it? And I totally get that. One little fun anecdote. In 1988, I was in Nicaragua. I was playing basketball on a team representing the United States in this international basketball tournament. our team was there because we were doing ministry things and connecting with other international teams and kind of doing relational evangelism. So we played against the Soviet Union team at the time, and it was when Gorbachev was introducing this whole perestroika thing that was going to separate out the Soviet Union, and and now it's become Russia and so on. So we're sitting in a hotel room, and we were talking with Russian basketball players, which was just an incredibly powerful and interesting thing to me, right? Like, I had never met a Russian. I'd watched all the Rocky movies and all the war movies, and the person I was talking to, Petre, I think his name was, he had never talked to an American, but he knew some English, and I, of course, didn't know any Russian because I'm an American, but he knew some English. So he was really carrying the conversation. I was trying to talk to him about why we do this work and what I do, and as a young, seminary student at the time. And I was talking about the love of God. And I remember him having very curious, confused notions around this. And so I was trying to find some connection point. And I said, well, Petre, do you love your wife? And he looked at me sort of curiously and turned and in this, what to me was just sort of this lovely accent of English, with a Russian flavor, said, 2-3 times a week. I love my wife. Which I said, hey, good for you. Congratulations. But also, I get where he's coming from, right? He's like, I make love to my wife, but I don't, he just couldn't, because the word in, I think, the English translation of the word, and I don't think that's just a problem of, a guy from the U.S. and from the Soviet Union in 1988 trying to figure this out. I think we're all trying to really say, like, what is this? And is it just a notion that we share out loud because it feels like we should, but we don't really fund it with a whole lot of meaning and all. So that's some of the thing that I'm wrestling with in this question is can it be the organizing principle? Can it be a way that we conduct ourselves? And can we run organizations based on love? I was working on a book for a while that I've since abandoned, but it was called Let Love Lead. And it was built around stories told by different organizations that use love as their primary organizing principle. And you'd be surprised the ones that do. People in the military talk about this all the time. Obviously, sports teams talk about this continuously, that we have to really be committed to and love each other. Some companies are organized around this. It's funny that some other organizations do that even more than faith communities do, where they don't really make love the primary thing. And I've also noticed, just one more little soliloquy because I'm all wound up on this. I know some pastors who won't say I love you to their parishioners because they're concerned about crossing some sort of appropriate boundaries.
Wow.
Like, we can talk about love, we can call for it, but if you look somebody else in the eye and say I love you, man, that is you have to be very, very careful of the context in which one does that. So we're just in a complicated moment on all of this, and it feels like we need love, obviously, as much as human beings have ever needed. I don't think we've worked it out. So anyway, long intro. Sorry about that. But how are all the rest of you thinking about this?
So I think that there are so many things that come up in just the framing of this conversation from your intro. Part of it is just defining love, right? We tend to have more access to what love is not, what it does not look like, as opposed to the tangibility surrounding like how we are pursuing, understanding, and expressing expressing what love is. And I would say that beyond the agape sense, but just in general, right? We are socially thrown into this mix, like your Russian basketball player, where the translation is not always transferable. In situations, we are taught love in a more sexualized context and in relationship to body and that sort of beingness, and that it takes some time for us to really grasp a different construct of what love is. Remembering growing up in my own household and just the expression of I love you was not readily available until we were much older, and for a multitude of different reasons. And then coming across individuals where like they just like it's so necessary for them to say, it's so necessary for them to act in. So I think that's part of just initially trying to think through how we are utilizing and operationalizing what love is, and trying to put
Yeah.
tangibility around it. But does after that, can love be an organizing principle? I think absolutely. I think that is the work of Christ, right?
Yeah.
That that
Right.
it is for God so loved the world, right? That he gave his only begotten son. Um, so I think that is an organizing principle, and I look forward to getting into that conversation with all of you later. But don't want to dominate just the initial thoughts. But yeah, it's like, how do we first understand it, and then what are we seeing theologically, spiritually in the practice of love?
Mm. Laura, Dominique, how are you taking this on?
Yeah, I remember in one of these earlier podcasts, somebody in the chat, we were talking about something around God's love, and the person in the chat said, "I think we need a different word."
Yeah, I
Uh,
remember that.
because love has been so bastardized, and so, as Stephanie said, sexualized or reduced, right? It sounds foamy and sentimental and like low fat everything, right? And when you think of when you think of God so loved the world, you think of John 3:16, you think of love as a organizing principle. It feels unsatisfactory to me to just say love is an organizing principle without descriptors of it, without sacrifice, without justice, without solidarity, without
Mm-hmm.
giving up, without vulnerability, transparency, authenticity. I mean, there's just love is a pain
Yeah.
in the ass
Yeah.
because it demands everything. And I think when you talk about love that way, I still resonate with that guy, whoever it was who put it in the chat. We need a different word. I
Yeah.
think we need a different word. And I think that word is something around a word that we recoil from. I think it's something around a word like sacrifice, something that has meat to it, something that we want to argue about because we don't want to do it,
Yeah.
something that feels painful and like it's stripping a layer off me and I want to yank it back. That's not yours, that's mine, give it back to me. I feel like that's the kind of word that I'm fumbling for right now. Okay, so I'll stop.
Yeah.
Dominique, you're going to bring it. You're going to make it real for us here, I feel.
I mean, yeah, so there's three passages that really come to mind when I think about love. The first one Stephanie alluded to already, directly quoted John 3:16. And I think, there's some principles that I think are more important to parse out about love to me than kind of the word itself. And so, like, John 3:16, we see that love is other oriented. Christ so loved the world that he came and sacrificed on our behalf. It's sacrificial. And the word Laura might be the word I use for what Laura is searching for is cruciform.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so when you think about that, the three passages for me are John 3:16, 1 John 3:16, which defines love for us and said this is how we know what love is because Christ first laid down his life for us so that we should live in that way for others. So it's just a completely different definition of love when we allow scripture to speak and set the tone. And then the last passage for me is Philippians 2, which tells us that love inspires us in light of having the ability to exploit privilege for selfish gain, to actually deny ourselves and put the interest of others before ourselves, and to live in a Christ-like manner. And so I think when we put those three passages together, we actually start to give some flesh to the concept of love and the distinctive nature in which Christians are called to love in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I like
those
that.
are some opening thoughts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Dominic, that has me. I mean, I also really like that First John bit, that section from the Bible. I was into Christianity maybe a couple of weeks as a teenager when I ran across that passage, and the John. People that don't know the Bible well, there's a series of letters that are written, and one of these is this letter that's called the letter of First John, and it's written to some unnamed group. All right. Some Bible books are named after an event, like a Genesis or an Exodus. Some books are named after the person who wrote them, John, or that they're attributed to. Some are written about, are titled by the name of the person they're intended to. The Book of Romans. It's really confusing if you don't know your way around the Bible. But this one in First John, it's one of the letters of people trying to figure out how to live a Jesus way, and it includes that phrase. If you don't. One has to love your brother and your sister, love one another, because God is love. A really provocative thing. I'm telling you, still in Christian circles, if you go around and saying God is love, or if you try the other version of that, if you try to flip that, and I'm not sure the text should allow you to do it, but say that love is God, man, it really peppers people's emotions, because they sure don't want God to be just sort of reduced down to love. It's a curious thing. But that passage, Dominique, that you mentioned is so good. I'm going to read the whole thing because I just pulled it up. This is the 1 John 3:16, which is similar to the Gospel of John 3:16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions, it reads, and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. One of the things I really like about that's there is from the earliest days of the Jesus Project and from the earliest days of the Hebrew Jewish Project, trying to figure out how you love your neighbor as yourself has been a deeply debated conversation, right? I mean, the reason it's written in Deuteronomy, the reason it's written in the Gospels, the reason it's written in a letter like the Epistles, it's all the way through, is people are arguing with the idea that we're actually supposed to love another person out of our faith, right? It's for some reason it needs admonition. And I find that really curious, right? That we're thousands and thousands of years into these traditions. And in every synagogue, every mosque, every Christian church or Bible study or podcast, people are still like, really though? Is that really what we should be doing? Or how do we the perpetual nature of the argument around this is really something to me.
Yeah, it's so ego-less, right? Like, so it's not ego-centered. And for human beings, I think that is the hardest, is one of the hardest things to do, right? Is to be ego-less. We are taught that the first law of nature is self-preservation, right? So we have centered self in our existence. We have centered self in the natural order of things. We have centered self in how we function and how we operate. But when we look at the example, the God example, when we look at the Christ example, it is a relinquishing of our ego. And that is so hard for many people to do, to recognize that it is not about me, that it is not necessarily reciprocal, right? Again, going back to all of these passages, that in God's doing of loving the world, it wasn't because the world loved God back. It wasn't that the world reciprocated what God desired and needed of the world, right? It was like, regardless of the return on the investment. And I used to say that a lot, just in my own relationships that love is not having an ROI. It's not like you don't always get the return on the investment. And that's so hard it's hard for parents, it's hard for siblings, it's hard, like people want to receive and to feel as if they receive what they are giving out, and the reality is God demonstrates that that's not always the case.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and that relates, I think, to what one of our viewers said here. One of our listeners says that love has a history of experience of being yanked and pulled into goodness. And I think he's so right on with that. We met out love as being a reward, we deny love as being a punishment. We
Wow.
somehow have bought into this narrative that it is important for us to have a moral standard bearing that we're holding to. I think, Doug, when you said God is love, love is God, when you flip that around, how it gets under our skin, I think because it feels like, wow, then what marks the in and the out group? I mean,
Yeah.
how do I define that I'm good? How do I define that I'm on the right path? It feels deeply threatening, which I think is why we don't really obey Jesus' commandment to not only love your neighbor. I mean, my next door neighbor, okay, actually, I'm all right. I'm all right. We have mutual self interests. Okay. But it's the love your enemy piece. You've heard it said, a knife and eye and a tooth for tooth, but I say unto you, right? Love your enemy, bless those who persecute you. And so I think when we sit in that place, that gets a lot thornier for us.
Yeah.
Because my enemy's doing some crazy things out there. Or I perceive they're crazy.
Yeah.
And how do I have kind of the robust love for them that is telling them, cease and desist from this crazy stuff that you're doing. At the same time, I am committed to your human flourishing. I'm committed to there being a world that's for both of us. I'm committed to, to the absolute bedrock truth that Jesus loves you as much as God loves me. I mean, we're all in this together, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's thorny. Yeah, I don't have any great insights there. It's just that I think that's the problem, right?
Yep.
I think a passage that's helpful in regards to part of what you're talking about is love is a reward, is the biblical reality that scripture makes it clear that Christ sacrificed for us while we were yet sinners, while we were enemies of God. And so that should frame love differently for us as not this reward for goodness, but it's actually in the midst of not being good that love is first extended to us. And so therefore, again, that should frame how we think about love. I think the tension that you raise is a good tension, because I think part of the reason why we feel that way is because of the ways in which love has been abused. And so we're not comfortable with love is God because certain people's definition of love is very distorted, and it's nothing connected to God. And so if we just allow everybody to freely define love without, again, rerouting it in the text, then that could lead to some very ungodlike manifestations. And so that I get the tension there, but I also do get that we are infatuated with having boxes that say people are in and out. And that is something that I think love should challenge and should critique. But I think a couple things real quick. When I think about other passages that really inform love for me, I think about, of course, Micah 6:8. We're supposed to act humbly, love mercy, do justice, which for me is important because uh, act humbly, love mercy is not the end. but love is supposed to actually transform into action. So love mercy,
Mm,
do
mm,
justice. And
mm.
so I think that that's important, because a lot of times love is we put the period after love, and forget
Right.
about
Mm.
the do justice piece. And then lastly, I'll raise up John, what is it, 13, 34, and 35, where Jesus gives us the new commandment. And he says that we are supposed to love one another as he has loved us.
Yeah.
And this is how the world will know that we are Jesus's disciples.
Yeah.
And in that way, love is evangelistic. And this is one of the things I think the church really misses out on, in the way that we have bought into, not we, but broader church, bought into this bifurcation between evangelism and justice, um, where we don't understand that love is missional and evangelistic, and it is actually how people will be able to distinguish who followers of Jesus are from other folk. Because
Mm.
when you live in a world that tells you that you only have to respond to harm when it directly impacts you, or people that you identify with, then the marker of a follower of Jesus is to be very much like the incarnation, where Jesus had the option to not opt in on our
Mm.
behalf, to enter into the pain and the suffering, but he chose to. And I think that's supposed to be something that's really a distinguishing fact, and identifier for the
Mm.
church. When we have the opportunity to stay above the fray, or to say, that's not my issue, that's somebody else's issue, we actually choose to enter in because we understand that we're all interconnected. And
Mm.
so,
Mhm.
So Jim Eaton has this great comment. I'll put it up here on the screen for people that are watching. He says, I've fallen into deep depression before learning to love myself and Jesus. I'm kind of interested in Jim maybe saying a little bit more about this. So Jim, maybe you can in the comments. You know, there's this famous statement of Jesus that he says, you know, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And there are days where I think, well, that's pretty much what people are doing, because people don't really love themselves.
Mhm.
So many of us don't actually love ourselves very well, and we treat others with sometimes the same disdain that we treat ourselves. There is something about that for some people, self-love is the more difficult path to take. You know, all of us could probably in our quiet moments admit that we would never say anything to another person that we're willing to say to ourselves about ourselves, right? There's sort of a way of talking about ourselves that's for some is really distorted and really harmful. So this idea of even separating out self-love from love for God, and the love we understand from God, and the love that we have for another person, regardless if we put them in friend or category or enemy category, they are linked. And that feels like part of this human project, right? And I think what Jesus is teaching, and all the great spiritual teachers are trying to do, is help us, Laura used a great phrase, find human flourishing. And boy, it feels like that is part of what we're trying to get to, is can we live into the fullness of humanity? You know, can we live for the betterment of one another and of ourselves? And because that is an eternal and internal struggle, it just feels like we should talk more about that. Like, I don't know, like it's not very, there's not a lot of churches you go into or communities of faith where you're asked to really fess up about how hard it is to love yourself. In fact, some people pitch a whole story that everyone's just selfish and only thinks about themselves and only loves themselves. And maybe that's true, that a bunch of people are only just running around just sort of fixated on the deep, deep love they have for themselves. But boy, my experience is most people are in a very conflicted relationship with their own past, with their own present, and even with their own future. And I just wonder if you all have similar thoughts around the role of self-love in
I
this.
completely agree, and I think what people miss, even in that part, because that's early Old Testament, scripture to love God with all thy heart, and love thy neighbor, and all of that. But they miss the Jesus piece, even in that, when
Mm.
he turns and says, and then love each other as I have loved you. Because I think Jesus recognizes that y'all don't know how to love yourself,
Yeah.
and so you are in this struggle with not knowing how to love yourself, so you are loving your neighbor as yourself. But then, that formation and what you are holding against yourself, what you are allowing your past to dictate, what you are carrying forward to other people, you can even scrap that and learn to love each other as I have loved you. And then what does that, for me, it becomes very, very much Paulinian and First Corinthians, 13, that, the marriage text, the marriage scripture of love is patient, love is kind, you know, um, love suffers, all of these things, right? So um, it becomes explanatory in ways that, referring to earlier, that is a lot more tangible. Like, how am I being patient with myself? How am I being patient with others? How am I covering the faults of others with kindness and long suffering and not holding a grudge? Like, that First Corinthians 13 text gives so much more context and legs to what it looks like to be centered and wrapped in a practice of love, right? So that we can then go out and actually do justice, like all of the other pieces begin to fall in place when we recognize that this is what love begins to look like.
Yeah.
I have this memory of being, about 11 or 12 years old and a brat. Wow, there's a very long piece in the chat there.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll give a
uh,
look at it.
yeah, anyway, I was 11 or 12, bratty, brash, putting the groceries in our pantry, lots of canned goods, heavy things, and I was slapping them in there, and my mother was in the kitchen getting something ready for dinner, and she was in the pantry with me, and she reached around to take something. At the same time, I was just pushing all these tomato cans in there, and one fell off the shelf and landed right on her foot, on the top of her foot, where it really hurts. And she cried out in pain and sat down at the little stool in the kitchen and just started sobbing. And I said, "Mother, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom." And she couldn't really answer me because her foot hurt so much. And she just cried and cried and cried. Later, I learned that my dad was having an affair during that window. One of my brothers had left the house. My dad had told him to leave the house, and he was 18 years old, and there was a lot going on in our family. And my mother never went off on me. She never said, "Well, why did you do it like that? Why were you acting like that?" None of that. She just absorbed that pain. And I share that story because it comes back to me a lot throughout my life. That was like 40 years ago, right? It comes back to me a lot to think that there's something about love as an absorptive quality that I think is, and I'm circling back to self-love. I'm circling back to something about how we absorb God's love allows us to absorb. It's a journey to the cross. It's a cruciform shape. It somehow opens up capacity in us, I think, to absorb the pain of others. If we're really Christians, if we're really following Jesus, then that too has to be our path. It's not a triumphant love. What's the Leonard Cohen song, that love is not a victory march?
Yeah.
It's not that. It's not that. It's something that is a humbling quality that starts to take on a patina in our lives. So anyway, I don't know where that goes next. I just know that I feel like that's part of the conversation somewhere in this.
Yeah, and all these things, these conversations are very sensitive, and they are very nuanced, because while I
Yes.
completely agree that love has this absorptive quality, particularly when we are submitting ourselves to the power of the Spirit. Because I think the Spirit plays a fundamental role in Christian love, because I think the Spirit wills us to love beyond our own limits. And it wills us to love people who honestly we would never choose to love on our own. Um, and so there is that, but I also am very sensitive to the way that the absorptive quality of love can be misused as a way of explaining away abuse,
Yeah.
and calling women in particular to stay in abusive relationships,
Yes,
and
yes,
marriages.
yes, yes.
And I know that's not what you're doing, Laura.
Right,
So I wanted
right.
to just name that in
Thank
case
you.
anybody else, because I know that we ministers have had a very troubled history of doing that.
Yeah.
And I think, another thing that I've really wrestled with recently is even the way that we talk about the crucifixion and resurrection
Mm-hmm.
and the violent nature in which we start to think about abuse as part of what love is,
Uh-huh.
and the absorptive nature of abuse as a manifestation of love. And so I think we have to be very careful, in how we nuance the language of love, because it is very complicated.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I also know one of the things that I always say when I do trainings around, um, you know, racial justice and biblical justice, and is that, a lot of times when we're having difficult conversations, a tactic that is frequently deployed in the church, particularly by our white sisters and brothers, is when a conversation is the temperature is going up, they want to bring it back to love, and let's just love one
Mm-hmm.
another, and let's
Yeah.
just focus on the love of Christ, and the language of love cannot be used to shroud out hard truths.
Absolutely.
We
That's
speak
right.
hard truths to one another because we love one another,
Yeah, right.
and we believe that the Spirit will keep us in communion in the midst of the hard truths that need to be spoken in such a violent and racially divided and gendered, distorted world, in
Yeah.
regards to the way patriarchy and all these isms have deformed the communion that God commissioned us to have together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you for raising that too. Right. It's not any one thing, and anything taken to an extreme gets weird and distorted, right? Which may be again why it's so difficult. Is that it, right? Because Jesus, we think that Jesus came to give us this like A to Z book of this is exactly what it is, but it's not. It's this highly nuanced individual walk, contextual walk that has some big framing principles to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're to go and apply this. You're to go and walk your walk. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
There's this book that I think I saw back in the 1980s called The Five Love Languages, I think, by
Gary Chapman. Yeah.
And I think that book is like top 20 selling books all the time.
Still.
Like it's
Still.
just outrageously around. Lots
Yeah.
of people talk about it, and it wants to nuance sort of. It's not really love languages around like different. It's not like breaking down the Hebrew and the Greek, use of the term. It's kind of saying that we take in and receive love in these different capacities. So people can look up that book if they want to find it interesting. I've been into it more and less in my life at different times. So I'm a little less now, I guess. But there's something really helpful about it in the idea that some people experience love verbally. They need to hear it be said. Stephanie, I think about your comments too. And I didn't grow up in a family where we said, I love you very often. We try to say that a lot in our family now to sort of counterbalance the fact that we didn't. Some people get love by serving another person. That's how they give and receive love. Some it's physical affection. Some it's time that you spend with them. There's a fifth one in there somewhere, and some people even added a sixth or
Gifts.
seventh.
Gift giving. Gift giving.
Gift giving.
That's obviously not yours.
I was just begging for a little, it is my birthday on July 5th, if you want to love me on that day. Yeah, gift giving is not. But I like the idea that there's dimensions to it.
Yeah,
Languages is a nice phrase. What's not love? There's a great Keb Mo song from a while ago, like "That's Not Love." And Dominique, I hear you getting at that. Like being treated that way. Don't wrap that in love.
That's right.
Love is not
That's
the
right.
bow. Love is the product. It's not the wrapping or the bow you can put on something. And I've
Right.
spent a lot of time around in professional and personal situations with abusers, and there's this whole pattern of, oh, I'm sorry, I was just trying to help you or trying to love you. And no, that's not what that is.
Exactly.
And it takes a lot because people have been conditioned up into this absorbing harm, which is not the same thing as bearing with one another. I think that's
Right.
the phrase that came
and
up.
I
And that's
think
a hard, that takes some maturity, it seems to me, to get to. Yeah.
It does. And I think that's why Gary Chapman's work continues to resonate with people, is that it is a growing edge of love. It's just because you experience love by physical touch doesn't mean that your partner is going to understand physical touch in the same way. It's that feeling that love is almost a discipline. It's something you learn. It's something that is learned by relationship. It's learned by practice. It's learned by communication. It's way bigger than just your own little piece here. So yeah, I think that's why his book continues. I'm not going to ding his book, right? And I know you're not dinging his book either. I continue to use it in premarital counseling, and if people haven't read that book, I think it's a lot of value, right? In
Pretty great. Yeah.
Learning how to love one another. Mm-hmm.
I have what might be a pretty radical question to ask, looking at Kim Collins's question. Love produces good fruit, right? And even in the discussion that we're having right now about the love languages, where one might have a need for gift giving or affection when your language is time spent, right? Is it love if it is not producing what the other needs or desires, right? And we can ask this question again very very radically, especially amongst Christian pastors, because I started off with, for God to love the world that he gave his only begotten son. But you have populations of people who are like, but I didn't need Jesus.
Yeah. Right.
But it's still
So
love.
what do we do? What do we
Because
do, right?
I think it's still love because there's oftentimes we need things that we don't know that we need, or that we're not ready to acknowledge that we need. And so, like, one of the things, like, we talk about the gospel as good news. And one of the things I always say is, but the gospel is not perceived as good news by people who thrive in the empire. Like, they don't recognize it as good news. It's still good news for them, but they don't recognize it as such and might not choose to receive it as such, but it is still good news. So I would say, I think it's a good question, but I do, at least in my own life and through the biblical narrative, I can see a multitude of examples of where people need stuff, but they don't know that they need it, or they're not yet ready to recognize their need for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I would back it up a little bit. Maybe I don't know where we all are on kind of progressive thought around the Bible and interfaith discussions, but for me, the truth of the Bible, it isn't true because the Bible says it's true. It's true. And the Bible gives witness to that. And there's love is the defining principle of the world, not because Christianity says it is. It's because we've all experienced that. You don't have to have the Christian language on it for people throughout all time to have experienced love. And I think you can flip that. God is love and love is God. Because the deep organizing truth of the universe, the truth of this world is that there is a pulsating force of love that's holding it all together. I mean, we haven't brought Richard Rohr and the universal Christ into this conversation, but we could, right? That there is an iteration of God. The first incarnation of Christ is the goodness of this world. That God saw all that God had made, and it was very good. And dang, I mean, that's close to love. That's close to flourishing, where everything that is alive, that has breath, is animated by the Spirit of God, flourishing and being who they are. So I just want to bring that in there too, right?
Well, look, I think that's there, and I know a lot of other people in my world are like, look, love is an emotional. It's a neuro pattern. It's a chemical response, whether it's affection or a romantic love or caring for the person who doesn't have something and you give it to them because you're manifesting the love of God, as the first John was saying. That's doing a thing to your brain, and really the world is a cold, evolutionary, non-purposed reality that we will give reason and rationale to make our time on this rock as it hurls through space more meaningful, right? And that is equal. And one of the things about, when you get into interfaith, and that's where I spend my life, there's another group of people that are also part of our human community that are like, there ain't no love ethic out there. It's all transactional and it's all just human experience. The thing I find powerful about love is, well, I don't know, my time on this planet is I am experiencing this planet as a human being. So I want to experience love anyway, whether or not it's somehow a part of an eternal force of love coming from God of all created things, or it makes my next 19 hours before I go to sleep and the dreams I have when I'm sleeping makes that a whole lot better if we're experiencing goodness and patience and kindness and self-control and the kinds of things that define love. So that in some ways there's just like this raw practical, and I'm not saying at all that you're not right, Laura, about this, but I'm also just thinking about the other people for whom, like, look, love is just a better way to go. And I wish we would spend a little more time in all of our relationships, like hunting out with one another, not just what do you need to feel loved as sort of a punch list of what do I have to do to navigate my relationship with you, but to actually say to one another, your life experience gives you an advantage to what it means to be a human being that is also true of me, but I don't have a way to see what you see. So can you help me see what you see? Because that's something that I also need to access. So this like finding the way another person experiences or transmits love is not just transactional, right? It's not just fulfilling the punch list. It is because there's something shared in whatever this means for us to live as human beings. And I just think like we should not think that love is ever the easy way out. It's, I don't know, it's something that just, it just grabs you by the lapels and demands that you pay attention to it. I don't know, like there's an urgency to love, it seems to me.
But I also want to say that it's not just like love isn't just grabbing you. We have to make a conscientious choice, right, to engage in and so in part why the question exists, right? Because we can say good fruit, but if you're bringing me dragon fruit and I'm like, that don't work for me, I'm allergic. Is it good fruit? That's subjective, right? And so there's a context, there's a way in which we have in some way already agreed on who God is, and the godness and the relationship and all of those things. And there are people who haven't made that agreement, right? That is not functioning and operating in that particular way. And we have to be in love, conscientious of that as well, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not, might not be their agreement.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think from me recently, I since 20, well, I mean it's earlier than 2018, but it's just like put the finger on it, right? Um, Learning how to be part of a family member within a broad family, lots of different political views. I know, Doug, you've mentioned a family member that it's challenging. It's challenging to be in the same room with them, challenging to have conversations with them. And I have found that I've got to stop thinking about what they should do, how they should treat me, whatever. I mean, I got to die to that. Okay, that's my crucifixion. I just got to die to that. I I don't even want to. I don't want that reciprocity piece in there at all. Going
Yeah,
back to what
yeah.
somebody had said earlier, I just want to be a person for whom I forget where the text is. The love of Christ compels us. I want to be compelled by just being in relationship with them. They don't. I'm not trying to get them to think differently. I'd love it if that happened, but that's not my job, right? And my affection for them, both demonstratively and then at this deep level, cannot be dependent on their views, whatever those views are. It's got to be deeper than that. And it looks different on different days, right? It takes on a different patina in different days, but the posture for myself has to be one of, I'm going to love you, and there is nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do about it. That may mean we take a break, but I've got to be rooted in that place.
And that's, for me, where the Kingian kind of articulation of love really kind of comes in and grounds me in places where, I'll just admit, I wrestle with the way that Father forgive them for they know not what they do is deployed. Because for me, like, it's even harder to choose to continue to love people when you feel like they know exactly what they're doing. It's not that they don't know, but they know exactly what they're doing. But we still called to choose to love them in spite of how they're acting and what they believe, and when their beliefs are you really antithetical to your personhood. And I think how love looks has to be nuanced and contextualized, because I think one of the ways the church gets it wrong is that when people are trying to navigate how do you love one's enemy, they want to dictate how love should look like for you when you're the one who's enduring that that animosity and dehumanization. And I that's not our place, oftentimes. But I think kind of to speak to what you're saying, Laura, I think for me, Dr. King has been like the most tangible illustration of choosing to love folks when their thinking, their acting is, harmful, straight up harmful to who you are and your personhood and dignity. And lastly, I'll just say about the Five Love Language book, the thing that was most powerful about that book for me was just seeing how prone we are to love other people in the way that we receive love. And I think that was important for me even as a pastor, because I had to sit and think about like my sermons and different things. And I'm like, I write these things the way that I would want somebody to preach to me. But like, that's not the end goal of what I'm supposed to be doing behind here. I need to be, putting the interest of the congregation first and where people are and what, how the good news needs to be them. And but that's hard. It is hard. So that was the
Especially
real
when there's
value
more
of
than
the
one
book for
person in
me.
the congregation.
Yeah, that's right. We used to do these community dinners, and we'd have 30 or 40 people that would come over on a Wednesday night, and people would bring things. And, the range of what people will eat. Somebody's on paleo. Somebody else doesn't eat meat. Some of us have this food allergy. Some of us don't want to eat fish. Well, we're all over the range of foods and the complication. And it's serious business. sometimes love in a community feels like that too. You stand up in front and you're looking over this crowd and you're like, I'm about to say a sentence that I know is going to feel extremely loving to this person.
Yeah.
And it is going to sound so off key to this other person. And trying to craft any way of being in a community that sort of gets your arms around all of that, it can become exhausting. And the same thing in a family. If you have more than, one person in your family, you're now navigating and negotiating. And, we had 4 kids, and Shelly and I. So like trying to figure out, like, how do you structure and pattern a way of life that's going to communicate and actually be experienced as care for one another? Man, this stuff is really hard. And so often we end up in an individualized relationship narrative around the transaction of love. When you get into this communal space, whether that's a society or a neighborhood or a church or a group of bowlers together, whatever it is you're doing, boy, it just becomes, I don't know. It seems like we have to have another way of being rather than feeling like we're tactically having to comport ourselves to every set of relationships. It's so there's like this, you get this sensitivity of the many ways that we all experience love and don't experience love. Then you start to put that into action, and it requires a level of maturity in oneself to not feel like you're just running ragged in the love brigade.
That's an image.
Yeah. I mean, how have you all done it as pastors? Like, do you, when you're in a whole community and you have a varying level of relationships with people as well, right? Like those, and everyone wants a slightly different thing from you all. How have you navigated that?
Very gingerly. That's
Right.
all I can say.
Right.
It's as Dominique pointed out, it's asking oneself, like, how do I put myself to the side and hear and be present for what another person needs, and to elevate their needs and desires above my own.
Yep, that's it. I would add another one word: imperfectly. That's how we do it. Imperfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Love can be exhausting. I'll just I don't know.
Yes.
But that's why what Stephanie pointed out is so important. And that's what I think John 13, 34, and 35 also points out, that love is a choice. Like, I think, we have this assumption that love is a direct byproduct of new life in Christ. That is not true. Love is something that we have to choose, and because of its exhausting nature, the truth is some of us just don't choose it. And I mean, I think that's part of what the Good Samaritan story is about. Like, I mean, it was a choice to cross over on the other side, and they didn't want to be inconvenienced by all that love commanded of them in that moment. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we got a lot of times where we choose to cross by on the other side too, because love is just, it requires too much of us in a way that we're not ready to give at that time and space. So,
well, that seems like a good place, huh? Thanks. So, hey, a couple of announcements here for all of you. In a couple of weeks, you're gonna feel a shockwave through American culture, and you're not going to know why unless you know that Dominique Gilliard has a book that comes out like a week from Tuesday. So when you feel that shift in the energy of the cosmos, that's why. In a few weeks, we're going to talk about that. Dominique, will you give just a sentence or two about the book and when it comes out to get people tuned up?
Yeah, the book is about how do Christians think about privilege and respond to the reality of privilege in the world. Right now, I'd say there's 3 major responses. Churches either want to live and deny privilege. They decide that it's too tricky of a conversation to navigate, so they just sidestep it. And then the third one is that they enter in, affirm it's real, but at the end of the day, feel hamstrung by the weight. And I believe that the gospel offers us a 4th way, and the book is unpacking what that 4th way is.
Great. So we'll talk about that here on this podcast in 2 weeks. It'll be out in a week or so, and I want y'all to to know about it. And the crowd that brings you this podcast is also going to be biking across the country and inviting you to pay attention to life experienced by our border practices and policies in this country. Look, there's a lot of people of faith who are also caught in political spaces, and they need some help thinking fresh about their politics. And one of the best places for a lot of these faith voters is to rethink how we treat the others in our world, those that we consider on the other side of some line, the other side of some border. And we think that love overcomes borders and separations and all the rest of this. So we're going to be biking from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida from September 10th through November 14th. We'd like you to come along with us virtually or in person. Go to the website. If you're on our email list already, you'll get all this. If not, you can head over to Vote Common Good or WeThePeopleRide.org and find out all this information there. Because we'd love you to come down to the border. In fact, y'all, we're going to be in Nogales, Mexico, and Nogales, Arizona. We're going to be crossing into the border and staying for 2 days in a center with asylum seekers. We'd love to have any of you with us. We're going to do a very similar thing in Agua Prieta, which is near Douglas, Arizona. We're going to do the same thing in McAllen, Texas, and very similar things up in El Paso. So lots of ways that you can connect along the border with Mexico. And then we have a whole other coast and a whole other border from East Texas all the way to Florida that also is a boundary that we've been setting and telling people who can come and who can't come. So this is a learning and storytelling effort. We'd love to have you all along with us, so you can find all that stuff over there. And you'll be hearing a lot. If you follow this feed, wherever you're following this feed, you're going to hear a lot from us from down around the border. And we don't want it to look like we're just doing something and you're looking at it. We want you to feel like you're part of it, whether you're there in person or virtually in any of those ways. All right, friends, thanks for sticking around for a couple of extra minutes today, and really good to have you on the following along on the podcast. And Laura, Dominique, Stephanie, we'll talk next week.
Bye, everybody.
See you.